I just want to be able to see my own text in those places. But if we could start. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I think we'll try to go through this next presentation relatively quickly so we can scoop up some of the time that Simon has he's graced it with giving us a lot of understanding of the whole TEEB process. So my role right now is in the foundation study. We had our third chapter, which was really setting out, this is context setting. It's setting out the eco-agri-food system, which is a term that I believe TEEB has developed this eco-agri-food system, so it really needs to be defined, I think, so people understand it. In this chapter, we described it as the vast and interacting complex of ecosystems, agricultural lands, pastures, inland fisheries, so fisheries is included, labor, infrastructure, technology, policies, culture, traditions, and institutions, including markets, that are variously involved in growing, processing, distributing, and consuming food. So it's very comprehensive. It really is. We started some of the initial feeder studies looking at what happens in a field. We've really gone to the whole world and the whole system. So coming into this, we're faced with this large challenge of where are our food systems heading? And we clearly have some major challenges just in that since the 1950s, the growing demand for agricultural produce, many farmers have turned to using non-renewable energy-based chemical fertilizers and agricultural processes. The whole system has become much more specialized and more monocultural, and the ways of processing and distributing food have emphasized the low cost and the high productivity aspects. And this has often devalued freshness and the wholesomeness of food. So in this initial chapter, in the foundation study, we looked at the problems that are so evident. And many of these, we can start with simply the production challenges, that we have this high production system of agriculture, which is where the food systems are trending, and yet the global system is really not functioning effectively. We have major issues of malnutrition and food insecurity around the world, real major centers in Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but in other regions of the world as well. In Europe and North America, there is food insecurity and malnutrition. And at the same time, we have this major problem of diet-related diseases and rising global obesity, with estimated at around 30% today of people are in some measure obese. The impacts of this is roughly similar to the economic impact of smoking and armed conflict. So we have this system which most of our institutions are trending toward this high input, high production system, and yet it's not delivering what we would need to have. There's been this nice analysis from Rockstrom and his partners in 2015 showing how we have really moved away from the use of renewable resources and having large impacts then on those renewable resources. And this was updated by Campbell in 2017, looking at where agriculture actually is impacting on these different ways that we're exceeding planetary boundaries. And agriculture has its footprint in just about all of the most egregious footprint, or exceeding the boundaries in so many respects of genetic diversity, phosphate, nitrogen in particular, obviously are just central to our systems of agriculture. So, further in sort of the impacts of the system in the way that we're heading right now is the loss of connections to local communities, that many of these modern agricultural systems, which trend toward monocultures, tend to have much less links to local communities. They tend to use less local labor, and they're not built on receiving the benefits from biodiverse landscapes. The volatility of food prices we saw so clearly in the food crisis of 2008, compromising food security for the most vulnerable, and then the trends toward consumers of more processed foods requiring a higher use of agricultural commodities to create a given number of calories. We did focus in the foundation study very much on global aspects of the food system, and so we did address a fair amount about global trade, stating that trade itself is neither a threat nor a solution when it comes to food security, but it does pose a lot of challenges and risks that need to be considered in policy decision making, and it is one of the ways that we can most illustrates the thought of invisible flows. So the hidden costs of the global food trade are largely unknown and are not recognized by policymakers, and it's these externalities and invisibles that are the focus of true cost accounting in agriculture and food. We used as one example just the invisible flows of global biomass. It's quite remarkable. It's not something we think about very often, but that global biomass use stood at 5 billion in the year 1900, and by 2010, the global biomass trade, just the amount of biomass that's being traded throughout the world, was 21 billion tons. 15% of all biomass materials globally are extracted or redistributed through foreign trade. And as biomass is transported in these large volumes, the underlying agricultural production can act actually like a mining process, moving resources from one area of the world to another area of the world. We've seen this very much in nutrient concentrations in several regions of the world as a result of increased biomass production and trade and then consumption in other areas, producing this nitrogen and phosphorus cascade throughout the world in areas of both high production and high consumption. This invisible flows of resources is really, I think, well illustrated by this diagram, which is showing, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong, so I wasn't switching it. That was the invisible flows of nitrogen. This, again, is looking at the flows of nitrogen. The world in 1961 on the left, and the world in 2009 on the right. These large stripes on the two stripes on the left are synthetic fertilizer and biological fertilizer, which were about equal in the year 1900. Or 1961, and they're vastly different, and there's just so much more going through those pipelines redistributed throughout the world between cropland, grassland, livestock, and then human consumption. These pipelines of the distribution of resources are much, much larger. My co-lead on this chapter, Walter Penguay from Argentina, has illustrated very effectively Argentina's role in amassing and exporting large amounts of nutrients for worldwide consumption. Being a large food and biomass supplier to the world, the continuous process of this biomass trade has resulted in the soil's nutrient depletion in Argentina, from an extremely rich agricultural country to having depleted soils in many respects. It represents a hidden cost as these soils are, in a sense, mined and very much shipped around the world through the biomass that's traded. So again, in our sort of global food system, is it working, is it not working? Another reflection of how it's really not working is this ways in which it cracks under pressure, conflict and disasters. Over the last 30 years, the typology of crises from catastrophic, short-term, acute, and highly visible events have gone to being more structural, long-term, protracted situations resulting from a combination of factors. FAO is now starting to account for the impacts of conflicts and disasters on crops and livestock. 58 million hectares of crops were damaged and 11 million livestock lost due to disasters occurring between 2003 and 2013. I think conflicts and disasters is an important aspect to keep in our calculation of true cost accounting, because it's very much related to our food systems. In 1990, only 12 countries in Africa were facing food crises. 20 years later, 24 countries are facing food crises, and many of these are long-term crises. So now that I've completely depressed everybody, I think it's important at this point then to step back a little bit and look at the larger picture of saying, yes, this is where, if we continue in the same path, this is where we're trending, but where do we stand right now? What kind of farm operations are currently the basis of feeding the world? And can we build from our strengths? We have major challenges and major problems, but we also have major strengths that we can build from. So we did, in this chapter, we did look at these various typologies of food systems, and it is important to realize that while modern industrial agriculture gets so much of the publicity, in fact, in traditional food systems, there are about 1 billion people in these food systems. In intermediate and mixed food systems, there's about 4 billion. That's 5 billion out of 6 to 7. And so in these traditional and intermediate food systems, we do still have diverse mixed production systems, or combinations of diverse mixed production systems. And many of these are family-based and combinations of smallholder farms and larger farms and fishery operations. So this is actually what is feeding the world right now. And we do have these systems to work with and help to guide through policy in a direction that's more sustainable. Another recent study by Herren showed that globally small and medium farms below 50 hectares, which is indeed a small farm in Brazil or in North America, but okay, more on the small side, produce 51 to 77% of the nutrients, of nearly all commodities and nutrients. And the diversity of the production systems, as the diversity diminishes, the farm size increases. But the areas of the world with the higher agricultural diversity produce the most nutrients. So that's quite remarkable. We do have this element of who's producing the nutrients and how are they being produced, and with the diversity that they're being produced with. We have a lot of strengths to build from. I had mentioned this yesterday in the Planet Unplugged, that as we look at the pathways to sustainability for agriculture and food systems and how we can address this looming problem of food insecurity in the world, this long longitudinal study that was conducted in 116 countries from 1970 to 2012, from Smith and Haddad. Haddad won the World Food Prize just recently. He showed that the most important determinant for addressing food insecurity is not production. It's almost always put up there. We need to double food production, 50%. I think the numbers are going down and down and down. I think we're at maybe 15 to 20% now as we get more realistic about it. But in any case, the number one aspect of addressing malnutrition and hunger is access to safe water. The second one is female education. So our food systems are social systems, and people are hungry and suffer because we don't have the social systems that are functioning effectively. It's really not, production is important. It becomes then the third element, and then the fourth element is diversity of production. So it's not a simple monolithic emphasis on production. So what can we do? Our solutions as we look for alternatives, it very much comes back to working with nature, with working on biogeochemical flows. The increased use of nitrogen in agriculture has increased 8-fold from 1960 to the year 2000, and yet there's extremely low nitrogen use efficiency. Remarkably, modern industrial systems are extremely inefficient, and they're more economically viable by being inefficient. So there really is very little motivation to move toward efficiency in a modern industrial agricultural system. But there are many measures, ecosystem-based measures, that can reduce this leakiness, like finding other sources of nitrogen other than the extremely labile nitrogen in conventional fertilizers, drawing on the ecological processes of nitrogen fixation, crop rotation, cover crops, using compost and organic manure, enhancing the capacity of soils to hold and supply plant nutrients, improve nitrogen capture by crops. Measures on a landscape level can recapture lost nitrogen from fields by applying watershed level strategies such as hedgerows, encouraging diversity, vegetated strips, and riparian habitats. And then as we look at really the big picture, analyses of whole food systems have shown how many opportunities there are to reduce this considerable leakiness by modifying trade patterns to become more localized. Controlling pests and diseases. The pests and diseases of crops and livestock remain one of the most challenging issues for agricultural production, but it's increasingly recognized that the approach that industrialized modern agriculture takes to controlling pests through application of pesticides in sprays or seed treatments generates far more problems than it solves. And again, we're not solving the problem. Global pesticide use has grown over the past 20 years to 3.5 billion kilograms per year, with a very large global market. Pesticide and herbicide resistance continues to grow even as the toxicity of pesticides increases. So we're still losing 20 to 40% of our agricultural produce production to pests and diseases. But the science of pest and disease control is increasingly returning to its original roots of just realizing that not all insects and microorganisms are a problem. There's almost always a subcritical level of herbivores or organisms within the system that exist there, and ecological approaches work to restore those balances when they become out of balance through a host of careful monitoring, use of cultural techniques, on-farm diversity, choice of appropriate varieties, and the introduction of natural enemies. Again, working with nature, communities are a part of nature, localizing food processing for local benefits. In our chapter, we identified 10 benefits of the invisible services that local trade and food systems support. And prime among these is the availability of a diversity of food that is grown locally, more and better quality jobs generated locally, and stronger relationships and social economy within a larger territory. So, in conclusion, the potential of these eco-agri-food systems, if we can make these invisible flows visible and contend with them, and recognize the capacity to generate positive flows, as well as to pay for the negative externalities, is really quite tremendous. And that's what we'll be looking for, how we actually can do that in a practical way for the rest of this workshop. So I thank you from all the little creatures that actually run the world. Okay.
Stay up here for questions, Barbara? Oh, you sit down. Excellent. So, Barbara, thank you very much for that. Let me open the floor for questions based on Barbara's presentation, please. Yep, Jackie.
Thank you very much. A great presentation. I think it really starts us off well. So one of the things here, particularly where you have communities next to forests, is a conversation about how we use forests much more for food provision and the sort of companion planting and so forth. So I guess the question is, how can we make sure in the adaptation of the framework that we're not just using biodiversity as a title, but really understanding how to create a food portfolio that includes food trees as well as food that's out in the field. And I think maybe that layer of localization is where we can see that paying off huge dividends in terms of equitable resilience, trying to improve local resilience by creating food crops that are far closer to traditional uses than than having sort of cleared areas out of that. So it would be really nice within the context of the workshops that we consider forests to also be potential areas of food production, not just for timber. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, and I think that kind of speaks to looking at, not taking a simple farm focus, but really looking at landscapes and territories. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
It should be A. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Goodluck. I'm just concerned on this tension now that we are going with TEEB that is focusing on ensuring that we sustain ourselves in terms of food, but at the same time to maintain our environment or our culture, or our nature. Now, one of the recommendations is that we need to reduce maybe the use of pesticides and disease control, the use of pesticides and disease control. I feel that the focus is on the use of chemicals, right? Now I'm asking myself, with that growing number of population living in poverty, we need to feed them. At the same time, we need to reduce use of these measures which are detrimental to the environment. How can we do this? That's a huge question of tension that we need to discuss, really. Thank you.
If I might just answer quickly. Yeah, I think we need to have confidence that we can do that. And so we keep saying we need to really, use these modern methods because we need to increase food production, and yet it's not delivering what we need. So we do need to increase food production locally and in the places where we need it, but to believe that we can do this through a sustainable system the conventional model is not delivering, and an alternative model, I think it's been shown, I think we really do have the evidence very clearly that we can do this with less inputs and really relying more on nature. It will take, it's not input intensive, it's knowledge intensive. So it really depends upon working with people and working with farmer training, but I think the evidence is there that it can be done.
Pavan.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I just wanted to mention in that context, because of course, for any individual or any agency to go into all this research can be quite daunting. There are some excellent papers. I'd like to point out one which summarizes what is available. And the paper I'm referring to is by Professor Jules Pretty from 2006. I can send you the details afterwards. In that paper, Professor Jules Pretty and his co-authors do basically a statistical compilation of different sustainable farming initiatives, 286 different sustainable farming initiatives from around the world, covering over 50 countries, most of them being developing countries, and covering more than 12 million farms. And they look at 8 different types of farming contexts. And the general term used to describe these various projects is referred to as sustainable intensification, which basically means using different techniques in different geological and ecological and cultural and social contexts in order to be able to produce more, but without harming ecosystems, without harming biodiversity, basically without environmental damage. So obviously looking at the methods which don't use chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and so on and so forth. So this is really, I would describe it, I mean, it's a great, in my opinion, one of the most underappreciated papers of all time in the history of mankind, right? Because it wasn't published by any great journal, it was some agricultural journal that published it. It wasn't published by Nature or something, because it didn't have a new theory which it was trying to test, and academicians love to have papers which test new theories. It was just reporting facts. Now, I'm a great lover of facts. My background is as a physicist. Life is facts as far as I'm concerned. So I love this paper. I think this is my most favorite paper. So I recommend you, because it just contains so much information in nicely laid out form. I can send you, if you write to me, just one table, which I quote often here. So that's the start. So, and then of course there are many examples that those who were able to attend yesterday's session on Planet Unplugged would have heard me commenting on one recent example where exactly what Barbara talked about. It is a miracle of social capital creation. It is basically using communities, teaching, leveraging of the self-help groups of women, which are in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, which is a state which has 55 million people, 6 million farmers, and approximately 8 million hectares of land under farming. So they are using different natural farming techniques, using traditional methods, but being able to generate higher yields, lower water use, less than half on average the water that is used by chemical farming, and basically compare knowledge by transferring women farmers from one location to the other, paying them salaries, and that's what the state finances, paying them salaries to become what they call master farmers, to teach those techniques to other communities and other villages. More than 500,000, about 520,000 farmers have already tried these techniques. Some have transitioned 100% because they are so confident of them. But it's a movement that is taking hold. So that's just one example. But I think first I would invite you to look at that Jules Pretty paper. I said it's my favorite one. Yeah.
Thanks, Pavan. Sorry, and if you could maybe introduce yourself and which institution you represent. Thank you.
Ok, bon, puisque c'est traduit, je vais parler en français.
Since there's interpretation, I will speak in French. There is interpretation, right? I'm Eladja Traoré. I'm from Senegal, and I'm a scientist there. I think that an issue, as highlighted by the speaker, is very complex, because the global population is increasing. So we're not expecting a reduction. So there'll be less and less resources to go around. So the available area will go down per person. So we have to produce much more within much smaller surface areas. And we have to take into account pesticides and fertilizers, but perhaps less toxic sources of fertilizers to achieve this. We have to work, in particular, on research to find species with much shorter cycles. So where now we're just having one crop per year, we could have 2 or 3 crops per year. And we also need a much greater output. So we have to produce a lot more on much more reduced surface areas in order to feed the whole world. So it's a very complex issue. We could also look at areas which are currently not cultivable, but see how we can grow crops there. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for these comments. I think they're very, very appropriate. And looking at, particularly, which we will be able to discuss more on rice in Senegal, the idea that if we really can change, really transform the system, that we might be able to trend toward how can you locally produce the fertilizers, and then Azolla, for example, a more organic fertilizer, and how can you then build local economies, youth employment, a more flourishing economy around natural inputs. And but we're not quite there yet with the research. I agree, it's extremely complex, and that's the point we're trying to make, the complexity. But we cannot just take one element and focus on that. We need to look at the system altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to say that Barbara has a second presentation tomorrow, I believe, on the Senegalese rice system that she's referring to. Sorry, further questions from the floor. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Carlo Fadda from Biodiversity International. My question is about, in your slide where you were showing how many farmers are, how many people are fed through different systems. If I remember well, the number is 1 billion from very traditional, 4 billion from kind of mixed, and 2 billion from intensive agriculture. And I think, what is really interesting is that, the level of energy and inputs that are required by the different people shows how efficient, more efficient are these kind of traditional and mixed systems compared to the system. But I think what was missing in your paper, you were saying the production for the first two, and then production, transformation, and marketing. So I think really one key issue is to develop economics for this very traditional, and for example, there are, in Italy, for example, there are movements that are making pasta from mixtures of durum wheat that makes the system much more resilient, and it doesn't require much pesticide because mixtures are more resistant to pests and diseases and to climate change, etc. So probably try to, I think one of the key issues is really to bring economics out of those systems, because otherwise the supermarket wallet will always prevail on other wallets, I'm afraid.
I would just answer a very good point, and I think something that we should consider. We had mentioned yesterday at Planet Unplugged also the issue of employment, and how many people are employed in food systems, in traditional systems, in small diverse systems. And I think people might say, oh, you're just trying to turn back the clock. No, I think we're looking at really good employment that involves what we call contributive justice, that people have meaningful employment through the knowledge that they know on how to apply in those systems, whether it's in the production or the processing aspect of it.
And just to reply also, as an economist, as an economist, you recognize that basically the value of the land is the kind of discounted flow of benefits that are expected to arise from that land. Okay? Now that discounted flow of benefits will be affected if in the future you can't continue to produce food because basically the effects of, say, pesticide use are such that it depletes the ecosystem functioning and therefore you can't produce more. That should, quote unquote, be captured in market price, but typically isn't captured. And that's partly because we don't, in some respects, have the science to underpin market behavior in that sense. There's asymmetric information or just a lack of information in that regard. That's the first point in economic terms. But the second point is also land tenure, which is mentioned already. The fact is, in economic terms, you don't really care as a tenant farmer if you're depleting your soil, if in 2 years' time you have no tenure guaranteed for that particular resource. Again, in economic terms, that's a well-known issue. but one that we continue to try to address. So it is true that in some respects the economics are lagging, but equally we've tried to have kind of bring economists onto this report, because it's TEEB in the end, to allow the economic argument to be made. And a lot of the challenges that you mentioned, I think, are ones that are known to the economic audience, but still we haven't found a solution to in terms of the market responding, which is what we're looking at. I mean, what we've talked about in TEEB is correcting the market, and this is exactly what we're talking about in TEEBagriFood as well.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is John Banga. I'm from Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania. I have one comment that we all know that there's a quite increasing pressure on different water bodies due to kind of extending farming areas and also due to increasing population. But I'm wondering whether, are we thinking of support that the growing technology can bring to reduce this tension to the natural resources as food demand is keeping increased? What is the role of these climate smart agriculture practices? Maybe kind of the precision agriculture, how is that going to help us maybe? We all understand that in many tropical forests and water bodies, we have this number of farming activities coming up and up, especially by the smallholder farmers. So how is technology saving us, particularly these smallholder farmers, to get the most appropriate and resource use efficiency approaches that can help to reduce tension? Thank you.
What we are doing with TEEBagriFood is providing a framework to do an assessment. So let me say it in a very simple way, TEEBagriFood does not do any prescription what kind of technology one should use. But TEEBagriFood provides the tools to evaluate it. And the technology discourse is a very complicated one. Personally, I hear the issue of drip irrigation since 25 years. Whenever there's a problem with water, someone stands up and says, let's use drip irrigation. But I don't see the progress in applying drip irrigation because the economics just don't fit. And therefore, we are coming back to the economic question. And TEEBagriFood provides a framework to evaluate what are the positive and negative externalities if you apply a technology. And therefore, of course, we support technologies, but we are not blind. We are looking at the economic implications of technologies and if they really can provide a solution for small-scale farmers. And therefore, we know that water is one of the challenging issues. At the time when Barbara and myself were still at FAO, we conducted a study along the River Nile. And we brought together the information of all countries along the River Nile, how much water they want to withdraw from the Nile in order to irrigate agricultural production. Everything went very well until we did the assessment of Egypt because there was no more water available in the Nile because all the countries before wanted to withdraw it. So if you do assessments in isolation, if you don't look at the impacts, the dependencies, if you don't look at what are the costs of applying a technology, you will end up in a situation where you don't provide a solution, but you create new and additional problems. And here TEEBagriFood comes in.